Roy's recording career started in the late 50s when he worked as a sideman for various artists.
My Babe song in particular, I think everybody recognizes Roy for. We were on our way in to do a session, and I was sizing up what we had, and we were listening. Sister Rosetta Thorpe had a song called This Train, and Willie Dixon had written words to it called My Babe. And so I just said, you know, Roy, just give me an E chord and hold the top, and so they're together. And by the time we got to Chicago, we had the song bound. It was ready to cut. And so we was in the next morning cutting it.
There is this British CD, which is a compilation of old singles that Roy played on, a lot of them with Bob Moore and the Timps. Of all the records that ever come out, certainly has the best display of some of his talent.
After Roy was introduced to the world in 1971, he started a recording career as the featured act, but his fans didn't respond as positively to his albums as they did to his performances.
So one of the reasons that his recordings never captured the breadth of his artistry is that he never pushed himself to play as well as he could play. And he knew that. And it bothered him, but not enough to do something about it.
But I think sometimes he'd get a producer that would put him with new players, and Roy's heart wasn't in it. It's like, you're making me play with guys, the guys that have been loyal to me are back home. Yeah, sure, I play, I'm Roy Buchanan, and he plays good, plays great for most people. But that truly inspired kind of thing, I don't think you can just turn that on and off like a tap. And there's a special combination of whether it's audience or inspiration. And just in general, musicians get that a lot easier from an audience.
From 1972 to 1975, Roy recorded 5 albums for Polydor.
His first album he did for Polydor, and his second album for Polydor, this was Roy getting on record with all these tones and unique riffs and licks and chord progressions. So that's what kind of put him on the map for the general public.
When we did that first album for Polydor, we were in the record plant East up in New York, and we walked in there. Roy had no idea what we were even going to put on the album. It was like a casual Sunday afternoon jam session in someone's back kitchen. Roy said, "What should we do?" And I remember saying, "Let's do Haunted House," because we had played it a few times. And we start playing it, take one, it's on the record. through with Sweet Dreams and the other cuts. I think there might have been one that we did a couple of times, but it was just play it. And there are some that you could listen to the record, hear some rough intros and endings and so on, but that's exactly why. There was none of the stay up all night and do it over and over again and lay down additional tracks and redub and change settings, change equipment. It was just raw and perfect. Just go in and do it.
The second album included this keyboard player, Dick Heinze, late Dick Heinze, and some session players from New York City that went to Europe with him. And these guys were very good players. The album that resulted, called Roy Buchanan's second album, won Album of the Year from Stereo Review magazine. But it did have sort of a sterile feel. The musicians were a little bit, these were New York session guys, and you know, I think that they were, from a personal standpoint, they were at a different place than Roy was. I mean, sometimes the chemistry in the studio worked, sometimes it didn't. Outside of the studio, it was something that didn't exist at all.
I don't think Roy enjoyed being in the studio. I think he needed the audience for the energy flow or whatever, his sound and so forth. And I can remember going into the record plant and they had a dozen amps lined up for Roy to use, anything from an old Fender to the latest model Fender or whatever. I remember just a whole line of them there. And you just went down the line plugging in and playing different amps. And basically the recording technique we used, we just run the song down, guitar amps, everything in the same room, everything bleeding into everything, and they're all done head on. All those tracks on that record I played on were done head on. I think Roy may have fixed some of his guitar parts here and there, but basically it was just straight ahead.
I thought that I had an ear for what would make Roy into a commercial commodity on wax, on vinyl. And we brought this band together and went into the record plant and made an album in New York. You know, I mean, we just had some wonderful people. We had a wonderful place to record. The band had never been in a studio before, so I guess we had some problems. I had certainly never been anywhere near a studio before except as an observer. And what came out was a blatant attempt to be commercial. Roy's third album, it was called That's What I'm Here For. It was murdered by the rock press. Rolling Stone hated it. You know, it didn't sell as well as the second album. And it was a real disappointment commercially. I brought Roy together with these people from Pittsburgh in the hopes that we could live and record together. And it just didn't quite come off. I mean, there were some things on there that I'm still proud of, some things on there that I still listen to, and some things that Bill Levinson, the producer of Sweet Dreams, the Roy Buchanan compilation album, put on what could be called Roy's greatest hits. But for the most part, the album just didn't work.
Recording session in New York City at the record plant. John Lennon was in the studio mixing one of the Yoko records. And when he heard that Roy was in the B studio on the other side of the building, he came over and offered his services to Roy. He said, "I'd love to play rhythm guitar on your record." And Roy said, "Sure. Let me finish what I'm doing here, and you can come on in." And needless to say, Roy got tied up in what he was doing and kind of just forgot about John Lennon. And Lennon hung around for several hours. You know, as I said, he was working, mixing this record over in the other studio. And then finally he came back in and said, "I'm going to go home, but call me, I'll come back." And then we just kept on doing tracks and so forth. And Roy got tired. We went back to the hotel, and then the next morning Roy flew home. So John Lennon never played on the record. This album had been recorded at Town Hall in New York City,
And it was a very successful album from the standpoint that it was well received musically. It was done live. It had a very raw sound, and when I say successful, I mean successful because it got us out of our Polydor contract. We delivered it to Polydor, and they said, well, this is going to be your last album for Polydor, which was fine because at the time Roy was being pursued by Atlantic Records, which at the time was the hottest record company around, and it was headed by this legendary guy named Ahmet Ertegun, and Ahmet, at least at the outset, took a personal interest in Roy.
In 1976, Roy signed a contract with Atlantic Records and recorded 3 albums for them.
I thought that the album that he did with Stanley Clarke, I thought that was an interesting idea. Because obviously Beck at that time was making that kind of switch to a fusion sound. He'd put out Blow by Blow and he was doing Wired. And you know, if Roy was cut from some of the same cloth as Jeff Beck, maybe he could do the same. But it was an idea that worked more on paper than in the actual execution.
After Atlantic dropped Roy in 1979, he went on to record an album called My Babe for independent label Waterhouse. Notable on the album are the unique sounds he creates on the song Blues for Gary. After low record sales and little radio airplay, Roy became frustrated by his inability to reach a new audience through his recordings. So he quit recording for a while.
He fell into the hands of lots of different producers, all of whom had their own sense of what they wanted to do with Roy Buchanan. And since you could do anything with Roy Buchanan, I mean, he could play any kind of music, and he could do anything with the guitar. I suspect that the collective mistake that was made is to try to treat him as a guitar hero, an Eric Clapton or a Jeff Beck, and not treat him as a guitar virtuoso within a musical setting. And so the pressure was all on him to carry the whole show. And he could do that better live than he could do it on recording. And the reason he could do it better live, I think, is that there was a quality about Roy of likability that you cannot reduce to a formula. People liked him and loved him. Not the kind of idolatry that you see with supergroups, but it was a more personal kind of love. It was more a one-on-one identification with him as a human being. And that's very hard to capture on record.
They had their own ideas of what was popular, and instead of letting him create, they created for him. I mean, I know he had a selection of his material, but they never captured it. The real Roy Buchanan on tape that I knew. I don't know if they were even capable of it. You know, he had so much to offer that it'd be pretty hard to get it on there. You know, it would have to be the right marriage, the right song, and the right arrangement. And I never heard The Perfect Marriage with Roy on any of his records.
I think, and what I've heard from other musicians and friends of mine, and it was my feelings at the time too, that as the 70s wore on, Roy didn't seem to diverse. He said himself they didn't really know what to do with him. The fact that he was so versatile made it hard for him to put him in a slot. And I think in the late 70s there, the general public probably lost interest in Roy.
When Roy came on the scene, he was really a groundbreaking guitarist. People were just not doing what he was doing. I mean, rock and roll guitar was at a much more, and blues guitar was at a much more technically basic level. But as Roy's vocabulary of playing began to become known, a number of other players incorporated his sounds, particularly Jeff Beck, who of course has paid tribute to Roy. And through that, a lot of Roy's licks became better known. So he didn't seem as original, say, in 1980 as he had seemed in 1970, because his vocabulary had become part of the vocabulary of the most technically able rock guitar players.
When he went with Alligator, I guess about 85 or 86, here was a resurgence, and I think possibly maybe a whole new generation might have discovered him at that point.
From 1985 to 1987, Roy recorded 3 albums with Alligator.
When Roy came to us, he definitely had blues intentions, and he also had a long history of people doing things to him on past projects, like making him record his guitar dry, or in one case telling him not to use any upstrokes because he played too many notes. We did settle into a basic blues concept, but Roy's definition of blues was one of the broadest ones that we encountered, and I think we all really enjoyed that. For a couple of examples, it included a lot of steel guitar insinuations in the way he played, because that was who he got his first lessons from, a lady named Mrs. Pressure, who he named a beautiful song after, who was a steel guitar player, and consequently he learned a lot of the harmonies and chords involved in that. We had a basic blues framework, but within that we encouraged Roy to express himself as much as he could, both sonically and musically.
Roy was very easy to work with. He was very relaxed. He played mostly sitting down. The other musicians kind of gathered around him, and he took a lot of feedback from the other guys. He was very soft-spoken. He did a lot of his solos live. He came back on a few things, but he liked playing live, and we liked that. It creates the interaction and the dynamics so that people would be playing off of what Roy was doing in the studio rather than playing off the solo that they imagined he would play later. He was shy on his vocals, as you would expect. He didn't have much confidence in himself as a vocalist. He was very trusting of both me and Dick, and Justin Niebank, the engineer who did those 3 records, to put the sounds together. And he was thrilled that we didn't try to tamper with his sound. For example, on the first record, When a Guitar Plays the Blues, Roy was using a lot of digital delay pedals. I mean, he liked that. Well, I should say not a lot of pedals, a lot of delay on his guitar. And he liked that, and we didn't tamper with that. Basically, he set his sound, and we recorded it.
During the recording of the first album, Chris Johnson, the rhythm guitar player who was using my guitar on that project, one reason I've never sold the guitar, said something to Roy about how can you be screaming so loud on the guitar and be so still and so quiet when you're playing. And Roy said, well, I'm screaming on the inside, or words to that effect. The musicians always really enjoyed working with Roy. First of all, he gave them a lot of respect. He was very easy to get along with. Sometimes I think the hardest part of working with Roy was getting him to tell us what he wanted, even though we begged him to lay it on the line so we could be sure we were helping him go after it.
I remember, kind of sadly, one time when I dropped him off at the hotel and went with him up to his room. I think I was carrying his guitar or something. And he wanted me to come in and talk, and I was real tired. And I felt torn because I didn't feel like I could stay awake much longer to drive home. I was after a session, and I felt his need for friendship so much. I was so pleased because I felt like some of what he did musically in the studio for me and for Dick was for me and for Dick, not for his own pride, not for making a record to sell, but a gift. You know, here guys, here it is. This is the innermost me, or some of the innermost me, and I'm extending it to you. And especially with songs like Matthew, where I thought that that special gentleness and hurt came out so much to the surface. As we went on and made the 3 records, and the first sold best, and the second not quite as well, and the third not quite as well as the second, we were all becoming somewhat commercially frustrated. We didn't have the hook for how to get Roy to a wider audience. And obviously his image didn't help. I mean, the balding, gray-bearded, ordinarily clothed, no light show, no glitter, brilliant rock and roll guitar player, there's not a niche for somebody like that. I mean, maybe now more so, but not at that time. And I was very scared about what I was going to do for a 4th album, trying to figure out how to find a hook, because I felt like my production ideas with Roy were getting a little played out.
Roy, I've got to say, was as shy as anybody I've ever met in this business. And that would, make it, I would think, kind of difficult for him to go out and to promote a new album and do that kind of thing. I don't think he was real comfortable with that. Roy was comfortable making music. He was comfortable playing live. He wasn't shy in front of a crowd, because if you listen to his music or if you had seen him play, this was one of the most aggressive guitar players ever. However, that aggression was done in a very, very delicate manner, and he did it on the guitar. There was no body English, there were no flames coming up on stage and smoke bombs going off. Roy's aggression was a controlled, very thought out, spiritual, if you will, type of aggression. And he used that, I think, to his benefit, whatever shyness he had as a person, to make his music much more powerful and much more soulful.
He didn't get played all over the radio all the time. That's how records get sold. He was more of a cult artist, musician to musician. Hey, you got to check this guy out. And still there's all the legends about, yeah, well, that record doesn't do him justice. You've never, he's a lot better than that, and he can be. And, it's, I'm sure it bothered him, but at the same time, I never got the feeling that Roy was driven at all costs for commercial success. Otherwise, he might have tried, some different things. I think he could only invest so much energy in the business side of it, because it's a nuisance. And then at some point, he just kind of shut off and said, enough, I'm going to play now.
Well, I have to say that the majority of Roy Buchanan albums sold to other guitar players. And probably what that shows you is how many guitar players there are in, everywhere for that matter, because the albums really did sell very, very well. And if you were a rock and roll guitar player from this area, you had to have everything Roy had out on vinyl.
It's just important to, when you listen to those records, listen to the music that's being played, not the song. Don't, his reputation rests on something so fragile. And maybe it's obvious to other people, maybe with the passage of time it'll become less obvious, but just his playing, not the band around him, not the song, just his playing. And listen to that, and you'll be moved, which is the whole purpose of what an artist does. And he was an artist of the first rank.
Since Roy's death in 1988, record companies have continued to release recordings of his music from their archives. In 1985, Roy performed at Carnegie Hall, along with Albert Collins and Lonnie Mack. The concert was videotaped by Praxis Media of Connecticut and sold under the title Further On Down the Road.
Now that's the most exciting thing of my life. me and Roy, we were up in the dressing room, and he tells me he forgot his cigar. And his cigar, I think, is downstairs on Lonnie Mac's amp. You know, and I'm saying, we're going to burn down Carnegie Hall. The Carnegie Hall is going up in flames. And anyway, I went down, got his cigar, and come back up, and then I picked up a guitar, and he had a guitar, and we was fooling around, drinking beer, just having a good old time. And I think he made the producers and the managers a little bit nervous because you never knew what Roy was going to do. But it went off well.
In 1988, Roy helped design a guitar for Fritz Bros Guitars of Alabama.
It's called a Roy Buchanan Bluesmaster.
He put together this demo tape to promote it.
One of the main features that we'll start with is like the tuning pegs, you know. One thing that's really nice that I like is that you don't no longer have to use these winding jobs, you know.